The night was freezing cold. The hard ground shrouded in mist. And by dawn, soldiers were on the move.
It was the 2nd of December 1805, and here on this rolling landscape, just outside what is now Brno in the Czech Republic, 3 mighty armies were about to fight one of the greatest battles in history. By the time the sun set on that short December day, the French Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte had achieved a stunning victory. A victory so decisive that it would set the course of European history for a decade. It was the Battle of Austerlitz.
France and Britain were back at war. After a short peace from 1802 to 1803, the two old adversaries resumed their decade-long struggle for mastery. France's leader, Napoleon Bonaparte, had declared himself first consul for life, and then, in December 1804, he placed the imperial crown on his head. The European powers were outraged and terrified in equal measure. William Pitt, the Prime Minister of Britain, worked tirelessly to build a mighty coalition of allies to crush this man, whose talent and ambition threatened the whole of Europe.
Napoleon responded by striking at the head of the serpent. He encamped his army on the shores of the Channel. He wanted to invade Britain and knock out his most intractable enemy.
But his navy could not escape the Royal Navy. In a series of encounters culminating at the Battle of Trafalgar, his ships failed to break free of the British naval blockade and were eventually destroyed by their British opponents.
But by the time of Trafalgar, Napoleon and his army were no longer on the Channel coast. They were on the move. They were racing to head off a mortal threat to France. They were heading east.
In the summer of 1805, William Pitt's coalition was rumbling into action. Russian and Austrian troops gathered for a massive strike into French-held territory. Napoleon advanced towards them at great speed. Before the Russians and Austrians could join together, he had encircled a huge portion of the Austrian army at Ulm on the Danube, and they surrendered. Tens of thousands of men marched into captivity. Other coalition forces retreated. Pitt's mighty alliance was already in tatters.
By mid-November, Napoleon had captured the Austrian capital city, Vienna. But still, the Austrian and Russian armies retreated ever further eastwards. Napoleon followed. By the 20th of November, he'd reached what is now the town of Brno in the Czech Republic. But still, the Austrians and Russians would not fight. What he needed was a decisive battle to bring the campaign to a close. And when he discovered this feature here, this piece of high ground that dominated the surrounding landscape, he thought he could spring a trap and force that decisive battle.
Napoleon saw this high plateau above the village of Pratzen. Here was the site to rout his enemies. To encourage them to attack, he stayed put, giving the impression of weakness. Just to the east, in the village of Austerlitz, senior Austrian and Russian commanders were meeting to thrash out their strategy.
The Allied commanders staying in this chateau argued between themselves. The young Russian Tsar Alexander had arrived in person and he'd taken over command of the army from his wily, seasoned old general Kutuzov. He was surrounded by arrogant, ambitious, aristocratic young Russian officers, and they urged attack. They wanted glory for Russia, no more retreats. Alexander agreed. Francis of Austria had seen his capital city captured. He'd seen his armies humiliated, and reluctantly, he went along with this ambitious plan. Napoleon was thrilled, but he kept up the pretense. He sent a messenger to the Allied High Command, ostensibly to discuss peace, but in private, he issued a flurry of orders to his subordinates. His army was divided into a series of corps. These were effectively mini armies, and they were each commanded by a trusted veteran. They were spread across this region, but now Napoleon told them to gather, to congregate here. That meant men like Murat, Soult, Lannes and Davout set out on a series of forced marches to get to their emperor.
Napoleon's trap was half set. What came next was a masterstroke.
Napoleon kept up the pretense of peace negotiations. A Russian prince was invited to discuss terms. He was carefully shown on his way French troops withdrawing, and he was shown, importantly, that the French had left that big hill over there completely undefended. In glee, the Russian prince galloped back to inform the Allied high command.
As Napoleon pulled back, he took his subordinates right across the battlefield and showed them where and how he wanted them to fight the battle. While the Russian and Austrian allies bickered, Napoleon's men knew the ground and knew exactly what the plan was and what was to be their part in it.
Napoleon was everywhere that night before the battle, visiting units, wrecking the ground. Just after midnight, in the first few moments of the 2nd of December, he strayed out beyond French lines. He was almost captured by Russian Cossack horsemen. He made it back though, and as he headed to his headquarters, there was a spontaneous outburst of affection from his troops. Groups of them held aloft fiery torches from the fires of their bivouac to guide him on his way. As the sun rose, the Allied situation was pretty chaotic. The leaders had only managed to thrash out their plan in the early hours of the morning, and the orders then had to be translated and delivered to all the different units. To make matters worse, some officers had snuck off to find cosy billets in villages rather than stay with their men in the field, so units were leaderless, and the fog was making things worse. It was not a good start. Napoleon commanded the battle from up here. This was his headquarters. Now, he had left his southern flank down here ostentatiously weak. He wanted the Allies to see that and to direct their main effort down there. That would weaken their centre, which Napoleon would then launch his major strike force against. He would march his men up that plateau over there. That was to be his masterstroke. The Allies took the bait, and the fighting began down there in the south with the Allied attack. The Allies advanced into this village. The French defenders here were outnumbered around 2 to 1. They hadn't made life easy for themselves either. They'd ripped any doors or wooden fittings off the night before to keep the cold at bay, to burn in their fires. It was dominated, this village, by this castle here, and the whole area became a battlefield. People fighting building to building, room to room. Groups of men would loom out of the mist, surprising even people on their own side, often leading to friendly fire incidents.
The fog was so dense that one could hardly see 50 paces. A lively fire could be heard, but one could not differentiate which part of our Allied army was attacking or had been attacked by the enemy.
Fighting was house to house. The French were pushed back. Reinforcements arrived who'd marched virtually non-stop for days. They arrived in the nick of time and stabilised the line.
The fighting in and around this castle was unimaginably fierce, but the French were able, just about, to hold their own.
The Allies were held. Now, Napoleon could strike in the north.
Napoleon was standing right here on this hilltop, and around 8 a.m. the sun burst through the fog, and the top of that plateau over there became clear. Now, the good news for Napoleon was that he could see the Russian troops on that plateau there marching towards the fighting down to the south. Meanwhile, Napoleon's main strike force, 16,000 men, was still hiding unnoticed in this valley down here, obscured by the fog and wood smoke from campfires. At 9 a.m, Napoleon gave the order to advance up that plateau. He turned to Marshal Soult beside him, one of his senior commanders, and said, "One sharp blow and the war is over." The French troops marched up this hill, skirmishers out in front, sharpshooters that could snipe at the enemy and break up their cohesion, followed by massed ranks of infantry, and then behind them, the gunners hauling their cannon up the hill.
But they came out of a clear blue sky. How is it that we have had no warning?
This gigantic French attack crashed into inexperienced Russian troops right up here. They broke and they fled. Not even the Tsar, who was just to the rear, could rally them. One Russian general, though, Kamensky, brought experienced veteran troops to try and stem the French advance. And what followed were two horrific hours of fighting. Lines of infantry standing only 50 metres apart, firing massed volleys into each other. Both sides ran low on ammunition. Finally, the tide of the battle was turned by a gigantic French bayonet charge. They closed on the enemy with cold steel and fought hand to hand with artillery in support.
Every discharge of my cannon opened up a great square holes in the enemy lines, and their 4 regiments dispersed in mobs of fugitives.
Kamensky was captured. Many of his men were bayoneted as they fled or lay on the ground wounded. These heights were Napoleon's.
As the French seized the all-important heights in the centre of the battlefield, there was also a savage battle being fought to the north.
To the south, the Battle of Austerlitz was marked by that vicious house-to-house fighting. In the centre, great masses of infantry would fire muskets at each other at point-blank range. But up here in the north, these fields became infamous for the gigantic cavalry clashes. Just down there, French and Russian horsemen would gallop towards each other, locked together in a mass of men and horses, sabres slashing, lances stabbing, pistols being discharged at close range, punching through breastplates, and then withdrawing, reorganising, and having another go. But the French had an advantage. They worked better with their infantry and their artillery. Now, if you look at the ground I'm standing on here, this has actually been landscaped by French engineers. There were cannon up here that were sending cannonballs scything through Russian ranks in the fields below. And the battle up here eventually was won by the French.
Allied units on the north flank were now separated from the rest of the army. Only skillful use of cannon and suicidally brave cavalry attacks prevented a complete collapse.
The French were now in a dominant position, but the Allies had one last blow left in them, and it would come here on this high ground that the French had managed to seize, tearing a hole in the centre of the Allied line. It was up here, in these fields here, that the Russians unleashed the Russian Imperial Guard. Grand Duke Constantine, the younger brother of the Tsar, led them in person, 17 squadron of horsemen, all over 6 foot tall, the elite of the Russian cavalry, sworn to protect the Tsar until death if necessary. The Russian cavalrymen charged across this field and slammed into the French line. The French infantry immediately formed squares, allowing them to defend in all directions from the swirling mass of horsemen. One square fired a mighty musket volley and a Russian squadron wheeled away. Another French square, though, was attacked and overwhelmed. It disintegrated. In the melee, the Russian horsemen were able to seize the French Imperial Eagle from a sergeant who fell beneath a shower of sabre blows.
It was a Russian triumph, but it would be the only one that day.
Napoleon himself was climbing up this slope following the successful line of his attack when suddenly he was surrounded by French fugitives from the square that the Russian cavalry had broken into. He immediately responded. He moved more infantry and cavalry to this part of the battlefield. He sent in his elite force, his Imperial Guard, and soon these two masses of cavalry, French and Russian, both the creme de la creme, were mixed together in a seething, chaotic mass. Eventually, both sides put in their last reserves, but the French managed to push the Russians back across this battlefield. They retreated, leaving behind this field here, churned up by the hooves of horses and littered with the dead and dying men.
The Allies were driven back in the north, annihilated in the centre. Napoleon now moved south to turn a victory into a rout.
I was under fierce and continuous canister fire. Many soldiers now incessantly engaged in battle from 7 in the morning to 4 in the afternoon had no cartridges left. I could do nothing but retreat.
In the south, there had been a savage stalemate since first light. This village was heaped high with dead. Now Allied commanders looked up to the heights and saw French troops streaming down to surround them. They were staring at defeat.
Our command was wandering about, saying again and again, "Lads, throw your guns away, or they will slaughter us all." But, despite this, our soldiers continued loading and firing. The enemy overwhelmed us.
The Allied troops reeled back across this land here, desperate to avoid being encircled by the French troops that were now flooding in behind them. Down there in that low ground, there were a series of ponds, and they were blocking the way. They were covered in ice. There were small causeways through the ponds, but one of them quickly became snarled up as an ammunition wagon caught on fire, and the soldiers headed out across the ice. Initially, it held their weight, but then as more and more of them went on there, the ice started to crack. And then French artillerymen saw from Pratzen Heights and fired cannonballs down in to smash the ice.
It was 4 p.m. and icy rain fell. The skies darkened. Napoleon urged on his troops to complete the rout of the Allied army, but brave stands by individual cavalry units gave groups of infantrymen the breathing space to escape. The shattered remnant of the Austro-Russian army melted away into the dust.
Napoleon rode across this battlefield, trying to comfort some of the many wounded. It was the first anniversary of his coronation as emperor, and he'd won a crushing victory. He issued a proclamation to his army that said, "Soldiers, I am pleased with you." Then he wrote to his wife, saying, "I've won a great victory against an Austrian and Russian army commanded by 2 emperors. I'm a little tired."
Thousands of men were in a far worse state. The field of Austerlitz was indescribable. Up to 20,000 killed or wounded. The Austrian and Russian armies had been humbled. The Tsar fled the battlefield in tears.
I had previously seen some lost battles, but I had no conception of such a defeat.
Napoleon's victory here forced the Russians to go home. It allowed him to inflict a humiliating peace on the Austrians, stripping them of territory, increasing his grip on Central Europe, and levying a gigantic fine. William Pitt's coalition was destroyed. And when the British Prime Minister heard about this battle in London, he looked at a map of Europe on the wall and ordered it to be rolled up, saying, "It will not be needed these 10 years. Within a few weeks, William Pitt himself, a broken man, was dead. Perhaps the final casualty of this Battle of Austerlitz. Thanks for watching this video on the History Hit YouTube channel. You can subscribe right here to make sure you don't miss any of our great films that are coming out. Or if you are a true history fan, check out our special dedicated history channel, historyhit.tv. You're going to love it.